Welcome al podcast de Palante Nonprofits. I'm your host, Andrea Ortega, y estoy super excited to dive into the world of nonprofits.
Hola a todos y bienvenidos a Palante Nonprofits. Today I'm joined by Doctora Yanira Hernandez, a proud first-generation daughter of Mexican immigrants, licensed clinical social worker, and founder of Valante Therapy. Yanira's journey in this work began long before her formal training, growing up as a translator, advocate, and bridge for her parents and community with over 13 years of experience in trauma-focused, decolonial, and culturally responsive care. She supports first-generation professionals. Before I continue, I also want to say that if you have been in any of my workshops, this is really important because if you heard me in all my episodes talk about scarcity mindset, as leaders of nonprofits, Hispanic BIPOC leaders of nonprofits, it's really important that we don't just put all of the load and weight of our shoulders of our community in our shoulders and in our budget. So I really hope that we can connect with you all and how this affects the way your nonprofit runs. But again, so she supports first generation professionals, Latin families, and immigrant communities to move from survival into healing and joy. And I would go ahead and say abundance, right? We're going to dive into what it means to hold these identities, to carry those generational stories and create new possibilities for ourselves and our communities. Thanks so much again for being here. Para mí, I'm also a first generation immigrant. I think for me, there's so much we carry that goes into our professional lives and we don't even know it. I had the chance to speak to a couple organizations this past weekend, and it's like, we don't have to always be scrappy. Our budget should reflect the work and not the overworking or the burden or the putting everything on our shoulders. And so, mi gente, we have got to heal and decolonialize, or it's going to show through the way that we work. But my first question is, growing up as the daughter of Mexican immigrants, what are some of your earliest lessons about resilience, responsibility, and identity?
So I love that question because, I said I am first generation daughter of immigrants and more importantly, daughter of undocumented immigrants. So that is also an identity that I carry being in a mixed status family and also being the eldest daughter. So I think when I hear about resilience, or responsibilities, these are messages that I think have been ingrained in such early age, about what that means and how it really shaped my identity. When I think about now and like things that I do not only as a therapist, but like an advocate, and just being very community grounded. And I think because I grew up in a working class, traditional Mexican family in the hood, I was born and raised in South Central LA, and earlier on, I started seeing my parents just continuously like work hard. I think most of us who are, come from immigrant households, we see our parents, just be hard workers, and to achieve the American dream, right? Because that's what they tell us, trabaja duro and you're going to make it here. So growing up with that mentality, it really, for my parents who have like middle school education, they work in garment factories. To me, I interpret it as, okay, I need to work hard in school. And so like my education is going to be where I am going to like work really hard. Mi mamá siempre me dice, tienes que echarle ganas en la escuela. So for me, I interpret that. That's kind of where I carried that value, right, of the sense of responsibility. But also being an eldest daughter, I have a younger sibling who's about 4 years younger than me. So always kind of consistently hearing like, cuida tu hermanito, so like take care of your brother or like make sure you help him with this or make sure you do this, make sure you do that. So I started really hearing those kind of messages of like, you need to be responsible in school and also responsible in being a good model for your brother, right? So now when I think about myself now as like I am, a therapist and now a founder of my own practice, those messages can continue to come up, in every chapter of my life. I think just as I navigated my master's, when I went back to school to get my doctorate, and now as like, entrepreneur, being a first generation entrepreneur, because there's, I'm the first in my family to kind of venture this out. I see those messages again, right? Of working hard and being responsible. So it really much shaped my identity on just what it meant to be a first generation, a daughter of immigrants. And one of the things that where like this is where my healing comes into play, and I know we're gonna talk about it further on, but like really detangling that and getting to know myself outside of those identities. Because there's just so rooted and ingrained in who I am that sometimes I forget that I'm more than just that, right? Because I'm consistently in this hustle mentality, like tienes que echarle ganas, right? And sometimes we forget to have or to experience joy, to experience rest. We don't know how to rest, no, we don't know how to be in the present moment. So that's something that I'm continuously learning and unlearning, with this. And also like one of the things that in my practice, I primarily focus with first generation Latina immigrants, and I see this again consistently coming up as well. So yeah, I think it ultimately has shaped a lot of my identity. But, like you mentioned earlier, that healing is so important, right? And there's no expiration date on the healing. We're consistently healing, or we're consistently working on ourselves depending on where life takes us. Yeah.
I love that. And I'm first of all, we need a whole episode with eldest daughters, and we need a whole episode on that mentality because, I think I mentioned earlier to you off camera that like I went to seek therapy. I've sought therapy several times in my life, but I realized when I was going to be a tech founder that there was healing that I need to do in order to be the best I could be. And I love that you're saying that you're never really going to reach that. There's going to be circumstances that changes, things that happen, and so you're always going to need to find a new identity or work. And I don't know about you. We need another episode probably to talk about navigating academia and our PhD program because I almost didn't make it. I took the full 7 years. I felt very alone. I was the only Latina in my program. There was no like professors, nothing. I didn't even really know what a PhD was, full transparency. I thought it was just like more school and like you don't realize that you're supposed to be creating knowledge and like all of these other things. And I'm like, I just want to learn. My parents told me I should learn. And then all of the politics within academia, just to do a dissertation, to do research, to become a name. It almost becomes like, oh, how many papers have you written? And I was like, none. I just want to teach and I want to learn. And so it was really hard for me. And then I graduated and I didn't really feel fulfilled. And I was going through some stuff with my parents who are immigrants. They're not undocumented, but have forgotten that privilege. And, I'm going through my own struggles because full transparency, and I've been very vocal about this, they voted for Trump and they're Trump supporters. And I'm not saying that people don't have a right to their individuality, but I struggle with their decision because it comes from a lack of education and understanding and a lack of really checking your privilege. It's not a, oh, we did it right, so they should too. It's the fact that we all have different circumstances and places we come from. And then it's like, they're your parents, you should be grateful for everything they give you. And I'm like, yes, but at what point is that boundary crossed? You told me to get to school and learn about all these inequalities. I mean, I got a PhD in public affairs, right? And like, there's no more public sector than that around data and system inequities than that. And it's like, I learned about it. It's real. It's not that, like, even the fact that you got a work sponsor, that already is a level of privilege above somebody who came from a different place. And not that to say that people can't climb their way up, but like that's much harder. It's the whole equity thing. It's from where you started to where you go. All that is to say, like, I'm really, really happy to see someone committing, their life to this very specific kind of therapy too, because you have to really, when looking for a therapist, and I know this is not a part of our question or episode, but like whether it's to help your professional, personal life, they kind of have to understand where you're coming from. Maybe, maybe not lived in your shoes in your life, but like understanding that these play a role in why you're thinking the way you are. And so it was really important for me to find a Hispanic Latina woman therapist, and I think it's been a really great blessing. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to go on to the next questions that Mira, I got ahead. So many, many first generation professionals, like what I just shared and we don't feel like we belong in these settings, or, and I'm going to add a little bit, we tend to acclimate. We tend to
Mm-hmm.
now become these whitewashed versions of ourselves when we go to these networking events. But how have you seen that show up in the people you work with and in your own journey, right? Because it took me a long time to really also like, just own up to what I
Mm-hmm.
look like, how I speak, and um, my first language is Spanish, but funny enough, I speak better English than Spanish. So, but sometimes I forget or I pronounce the wrong thing, and it's like just owning up to it. Like I'm bilingual, and that is a superpower, not something to
Absolutely.
deflect. But I think I struggled a lot also with academia, being in that place of the power dynamics that exists there.
Absolutely.
But so would love to know a little bit more about your experience there.
Yeah. You just dropped so many gems, Andrea. And I think that, um, it's heavy on the assimilation many of us have to do when we enter academia. And this is something that I speak very often because, one of the things that I specialize is really navigating the imposter phenomenon, as we often call it, imposter syndrome. And one of the things that I see often with this aspect when folks, especially like first gen individuals, say, like, I have imposter syndrome because I can't do X, Y, and Z, or like I don't see myself represented. It's so individualized and so internalized, right? The way the academia makes you believe that something is wrong with you, right? And I actually just did a keynote on this because one of the things that I mentioned is that when we really think about like who these higher education institutions were built for, they were not built for people like us in mind. I went to UCLA for undergrad, and I always think about like, you think that the founders, creators of UCLA thought about like, let me build this campus for first generation Mexican American whose parents are undocumented and lives in the hood. Absolutely not, right? They were created to specifically exclude Black and Brown people. So we think about the historical context of it. And when we enter into these spaces, for a lot of us, depending on where we grew up, perhaps it's culture shock, right? I remember for me, growing up in a predominantly Black and Brown community, like when I enter UCLA, it's right next to Beverly Hills. Westwood is, neighbor city to Brentwood and Beverly Hills. And like, you don't see a lot of people who look like me. The hoop earrings, the Jordans, that was non-existent back then. Now it's a cool thing, right? But like back then, it wasn't a thing, right? So, and you come into the spaces, you don't see yourself reflected in your classes that you're in. And one of the things about me is that I actually entered as a pre-med student. I was a biochemistry major. I was set to go into the pre-med track. I was taking all math and sciences, and then I realized like I just felt so dumb. I felt like I didn't belong. I didn't feel myself seen. And I was like a 4.2 student. Like I was the top of my class in high school, and I couldn't believe, I was like, how do I go from being a star student to like struggling, And I just didn't know the roadmap. I didn't know how to go to office hours. I didn't know how to ask for mentorship. I didn't see visibility or representation in my classes. Oftentimes I was the only Latina class. And I remember this like biology class that I took and like literally no Latinos. And I remember I saw like one Black student. I was like, okay, I feel kind of seen here. Like, I feel like we can be friends, because predominantly we're white students in that class. And I think that I found myself being so checked out from that class that I realized like, you know what, this pathway is not for me. Like I wasn't built for this, and I think that once I switched my major, I was a women's studies major and education studies minor, that obviously through those discussions and like the theories, I'm like, oh, this is where my people is at. I saw myself reflected in those spaces. But I think that this whole time I was walking with the belief that something was wrong with me and that I didn't belong. And I carried that. I didn't realize now that looking back, in the moment, I didn't really realize that. I didn't have that reflection, right? But I carried that when I went to grad school for my master's at USC. I was replicating the same thing. I wasn't really seeking out for a lot of support, taking advantage of all the resources, right? I was just like, let me just do my work and like, let me just be here. Let me get this master's because I should be very proud and lucky that I got admitted to USC and I have my cute little master's, right? And So once I entered the field and got licensed, started doing clinical work, I went back to get my doctorate and I went back to USC. But then I'm like, F that. I'm gonna do it right this time. And I'm like anything that I was invited to, I'm like, I'm gonna get if I'm gonna get a little USC pen, I'm gonna get that. Whatever. I was gonna take advantage of everything, right? Because I felt like I needed to do a redo of grad school. But this whole time I still navigated with like feeling like I didn't belong. Like I wasn't smart enough, even though I had gotten into my doctor program, you know. So I think that's when I started really, really dissecting what it means to these kind of messages that we've gotten that we're imposters. And one of the things that I tell folks is that when the initial definition of imposter phenomenon came up in the 1970s, the research was actually done on white women who had PhDs or who were really successful in their career. And actually, Dr. Clance, who was coined the term, imposter phenomenon, she noticed that she felt like she was being phony even herself, which is why it kind of really ignited her research. Like, why do I feel like I'm phony? I have to fake it till I make it, even though I have my PhD, right? So now we think about it just like the research sample, right? And we're kind of putting on those like academic goggles, like there was no people, brown, no BIPOC folks in that sample size, but somehow we think we're imposters, right? And that definition fails to acknowledge the systems that have made BIPOC first or just folks with marginalized identities to feel that way to begin with, right? So all the isms that we can think of, right? It did not take account for the racism that happens, for many of us that we internalize those messages that we don't belong, classism, that also happens, ableism, sexism, all the isms, right? So when we really think about like, well, why do I feel like I don't belong here? Is because the systems were not built for people like us. And somehow we've internalized that it is somehow our fault. So one of the things that I came into in contact with a professor from San Diego State, Dr. Nellie Tran, and she writes about how like we're not imposters, but we're infiltrators. We really infiltrated a system into where we are just kind of it's like we know we're not going to get accepted here, right? And how do we continue to exist here to make sure that we don't lose our identities and try to assimilate, right? Because I think when we think about imposter, part of those heavy emotions come up because we want to assimilate. We want to be accepted by the dominant culture. We want to be seen. Like you said, like you have a published article, like, yay, I'm finally like, I feel like I'm, like I did it. We're always looking for that validation from the academy that somehow we are enough, and that's why we should be here. Those one of the things that I bring into my therapy sessions with my clients because I'm like, okay, you're mentioning that you're feeling, you have a lot of self-doubt, that you're feeling even depressed, you have a lot of anxiety. Let's acknowledge those emotions and let's also bring in the this context of it. So I look at things very like with intersectionality into colonial lenses because it's really important to acknowledge that, right? Because otherwise it just becomes a band-aid, of like, okay, well, let's, use this coping strategy to make you start feel better. But that's still very individualistic, of like what you need to do. Add it to the to-do list of what you need to do to take care of yourself, ¿verdad? Entonces, being able to understand that it's like, oh shit, like I am in a place where literally it was not built for me. And like, how can I continue to coexist, bring in my gifts that I already have and not lose my identity, not lose myself when I am in this space. So it's something that because I see not only college students, graduate students, but I also see just first-gen professionals. And it's the same way when like in any profession, like in tech, I have Latinas in tech, I have Latinas in health, I see other therapists as well, people that are in higher education. So just like in a lot of different spaces, but the theme continues to be the same, not feeling like we're enough. And then if we grew up with messages in our upbringing that we have to continue to work hard and be responsible, kind of to your initial question, then it's going to validate that. I'm like, okay, pero tengo que trabajar más. This is the way that I am responsible and how I should be, and we just accept it. So we do a lot of unlayering in the therapy sessions, so it's very common, unfortunately, for a lot of us that are first gen and even second generation, because sometimes we just repeat those same messages, we just pass them along. Yeah, so un poquito de todo.
Yeah, I need to address a bunch of stuff because shout out to every Latina woman who was going to be a doctor, and then that was me. I feel like we lived very the similar parallels, and I remember I even got to taking the MCAT, and I walked out of it, I was like, yeah, I just need to stop pretending I want to do this because I do not. And I did not, and that was senior year of college. And then those systems aren't built for you, and even in the professional workforce, I remember like sometimes they made us work Christmas Eve. I was like, I'll switch Christmas Eve for the 25th, like little small cultural things, porque para nosotros el 24 is more important. And it's so like that's a small thing of so many things that we face on the day to day in our professional and in academia, and that I faced in academia. A lot of the people in my cohort either had parents who had PhD, so they knew what to expect. They understood what that was. Like our parents don't understand what a doctorado is. They don't realize that like that's not a medical doctor, and then to have to explain that I'm going into the nonprofit sector, the no makes money sector, and then like having to really understand, the careers that exist here, which are different from our own countries and, their own journeys. I also want to really highlight para mi gente, we are not imposters, we're infiltrators. That's such a big, oh my God, you need to make merch out of that. I'm like
And
huge
let,
on
let, let
merch,
let
and you
that
need
sink
to.
in, right?
Yeah.
Even when you say it, right? You said it like we're not imposters, we're infiltrators. Like even if you just like notice how like that felt you saying it, right? It
It felt
it,
so
it
good.
shifts. It
Yeah.
shifts, right?
It shifts. It shifts for me. It shifts for my daughters, because like part of the reason why I struggle with politics right now is because I know where I am. I know the things I've built and the things I have, and yes, it can be taken away, but I mostly worry about my children's future and how growing up is going to look for them. School as I knew it is not the same for them. School, they're, I mean, in Florida, they're banning books left and right. And so like it's just so insane how different I wish this world was for them. And I think of like, wow, if I could even teach something like that, like because we were taught to assimilate, then our generation felt the imposter. And now my children can recognize their infiltrators, or maybe not have to feel anything at all. And maybe they live in a world where now they're not labeled as that, and systems are perfect and equitable for everybody. But that's not going to happen. But at least we've come a long way, from that kind of generation. And then I want to highlight to my listeners, believe it or not, if you don't understand what it means to be decolonialized. This is a new term for me, I think, this year, where I finally understood that there's actually, I would say it's a part of our evolution, nuestra gente, and how we've done it. And I think I knew, but I finally understanding that I'm not the only one that feels that way. Like, because when trying to explain, I have a trigueño, right? Like darker, that's how we say darker dad, and a mom with white and green eyes, and not understanding even, the kind of mentality of like, don't spend too much out in the sun or don't go
Mm-hmm.
tan. And it's like, or comments growing up of like, estás muy trigueñita or estás muy morenita, and it's just like, I've been in really lucky where my circle growing up was very much like, yeah, and what, So like, but if we look at that, that affects how we grow up, that affects our professional lives. And so, para mi gente, decolonizar and read into it and learn to understand more how it's affecting and creating that scarcity mindset and creating that imposter syndrome, because success historically has always looked white.
Mm-hmm.
And this, for me, I think obviously a lot of people like decolonizing is something like, oh wow, we don't talk about that or anything, but like it should be talked about because
Yeah.
nowadays, and this is where representation matters. It doesn't have to look like that. It's
Hmm.
why you now see a woman of color, going to space or all of these things, and
Hmm.
they all tie back to like what people viewed as success. And anyways, I just want to highlight those 3 points because they really touched me. And I'm going to do one last question before I tell people how to follow you or share with you or tell their friends to hire you. But my last question is really around, like I told you, I've met with a lot of nonprofits, and part of the mission I'm on is that I've reviewed grants, and there are white-led organizations who will ask for everything and anything and put everything in their program versus a smaller grassroots Hispanic counterpart who might not ask for enough or might
Hmm.
come from a place of like, we have to carry that weight. And then in my talk, I even mentioned to them, like, if you're an organization that works con, mujeres de víctima de abuso, put
Hmm.
in there therapy for your employees so you have less turnover. Like, and everybody like, o sea, deja abierta la boca, but I'm like, no, that's a part of what's gonna make your program successful, to
Hmm.
put your case managers, first too, because those are really big and heavy things. So those are some ways que yo trabajo con mis organizaciones, pero would love to know, like, and it doesn't have to be nonprofit professionals. Obviously, this is kind of like the niche, pero how do you work with professionals who carry that weight? What are some things that they can do to care and stay grounded in this work so they don't feel it? And
Yeah.
especially now,
That
I work
part.
with a lot of, communities that work with migrants. And sorry I took over your answer, pero especially now, like I also worked with an organization who has to do a lot of they're helping unaccompanied minors back to reunite
Hmm.
with their parents who have been deported.
Hmm.
And that has to be heavy.
Hmm.
God, that has to be
Yeah.
so heavy.
Yeah.
And my therapist, I go on like rage posting on my Instagram. My therapist has said I should find better ways that are within my control. But like, what are some ways that we can, not carry the weight of our shoulders?
Yeah. One thing I do want to mention is that I think that one, the rage is very valid, right? Especially right now. So I don't want to dismiss that because I personally feel rage myself, and sometimes I have to find healthy ways to able to channel that as well. But I do think that oftentimes what happens is that because we may see ourselves reflected with the people that we help, we have this aspect of self-sacrificing, or we're doing it for the cause, that we don't ask for everything and, like, all the resources that may be available for us, right? And because of that same mindset of like and I'm really careful when I say scarcity, because I do think that a lot of when we say scarcity mindset, we cannot say scarcity mindset without really acknowledging the systems that have created for us to think that way. So I do think that a lot of the times, that because we see ourselves reflected with the people that we have, we feel like we have this sense it's only us, like we're only carrying the load, and we forget how to take care of ourselves. And one of the things that I do in my trainings too is that when I speak about burnout and compassion fatigue, is that taking care of yourself is also equity work, because you're here for the long run. Because if you leave, then there's nobody helping out our comunidades, and sometimes that's what happens. Like, a lot of these systems have been built to burn people out, and it's not sustainable, right? We end up leaving. We create our own businesses, but then we end up replicating the same cycles that we left, and so it's like it's important to be able to just check in with ourselves, and finding different ways that center us back. And there's many different ways that you can look about it. You can look about more like the individual ways. You can look at it in more kind of macro ways that we can do at a systemic level. But just individually, I think one of the things that I always tell folks, especially I sit as a board member for a nonprofit organization, and one of the things that when I do workshops is just really telling staff is like, okay, like, I know why you're here. Like, your why is very evident. Many of us are passionate, like we see ourselves represented with the communities that we're supporting. But now I want to know the how are you doing right now, where you're not taking this in all the emotional and physical toll every single day back home. And now on your weekends that you're supposed to rest, you continue to have this same level of exhaustion, and you're not showing up for your familia, for yourself. You're not enjoying rest. You're not doing anything joyful. Right. And one of the things, it's like simple things that could support us with our shifts within the organization. And one of them is just like giving yourself permission that asking for help is okay. And asking for help, it just doesn't mean with intra or agency, just not within the agency. It could also be outsourcing and asking for help outside of that. It's like, yo sé que tú puedes sola, but we don't always have to do it by ourselves. And so just recognizing that asking for help, and maybe that means like how you mentioned earlier, like putting out on the grant, like we need to hire these people, this person, this person, this person in order to carry out our mission, right? So being able to be okay with asking for help. And then another thing is like finding simple ways that we can have, like, it's what I like to call like compassionate boundaries, because I think oftentimes we're so accustomed to, again, self-sacrifice, give, 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 and we may feel guilty, honoring those boundaries because, ay, no sé qué va a decir Julanito de tal, or maybe we're just never accustomed to set boundaries, right? From those early childhood messages that we might have received. But like compassionate boundaries of like, hey, either something as very simple as like, I won't be available, for this time to this time. Can we meet next time? Right? Or like, thank you so much for your willingness to connect with me. Can't we pin this for a different day? Oh, and I'll give you, and sometimes that's hard to do when we're inclined to like, oh my God, but I'm really passionate. I really want to do this. Like, and we feel that fear of like, if I let it go, it's never going to come back. So reminding ourselves that no, like we're in it, you're going to get it tripled, and I say this because this actually recently happened to me. I had someone who reached out to me to do a collaboration on, to speak about like how to support our day. And then right now, like if I don't schedule you like in advance, like last minute is going to be very, very difficult for me, especially during like Latina Heritage Month, because I just have so many commitments. And this person reached out to me like, I have something planned. Like, can we do it like within a few weeks? And I think like past me would have said yes in a second because I'm like, it's for our gente. I want to like get the word out. I'm passionate about this. But I realized that yes was going to be at the compromise of my own well-being. And if you want me to show up like authentically me and coming in hot, I'm gonna need some rest, because I can't do it right now. So I did let him know like, hey, like this would be amazing, but can we circle back at the beginning of the year? Because this is something that, I have a lot of commitments and I want to make sure that I'm showing myself fully in our collaboration. And he said, yes, absolutely. Let's circle back in January. Perfect. So sometimes it's being able to provide, knowing, oh, like when is my cup full, that I'm like, is my yes actually a no inside, so just being able to have those compassionate boundaries, and see how they really replicate around the agency, around the like whatever system that you may be a part of. But simple shifts can be very powerful in our just day to day, and how. But ultimately, like I think that when I think about the organization, I'm always thinking about like, okay, this is not just like an individual thing. It can be embedded and so woven into the every parts of the organization that now this is the norm, and that's usually when I do any type of professional development trainings. It's like, okay, I can tell you what to do individually, but at the end of the day, if it's not being conducted in, also systemically at the larger, like the macro level, then we're not going to see change, right? We're going to see continue to have overpowered people who are just consistently just overworking, right? And they won't be sustainable. They're going to leave and you're just going to replicate the exact same thing, right? So we want to be able to have organizations that are sustainable, right? To overall carry out the mission that we intend to carry out. So yeah, so many aspects to this question, but I do think that it starts with simple shifts, and it also starts with systemic responsibility.
I love that. And I think para mi gente escuchando, especially if you're leaders of a small or already running nonprofit, learning to say no was my biggest takeaway. It's learning to say no, that money is not always good money, that funder is not always good because, whether it's a mission misalignment or, I tell people even like, why are you going to apply to the grant? The reporting is way past your capacity and, or apply to the grant, but make sure you put the necessary support that you need to make
Mm-hmm.
that grant come forward. And so I think saying no is a really big aspect of any leader. It's probably, if you talk to any successful leader, that's probably one of the things that they have kind of mastered the most,
Mm-hmm.
really shifting their strategies and priorities. Digo, I know you have a wonderful Instagram where you share a lot of different things, pero
Yeah, so I am on Instagram, Palante Therapy. You can also find me on my website, palantetherapy.com to reach out if you need any further support. In addition to providing individual therapy, I also do a lot of like speaking engagements, whether it's keynotes, PD, presentations, workshops, pláticas, panels, fireside chats, all that good stuff. So feel free to connect with me at palantetherapy.com, or you can find me again on the gram at palantetherapy.
yes, on the gram. Gracias again. I feel very blessed that I got on your calendar. It's really important that we really are very, that we're very present in the things we say yes to. That also changes how we show up and how we're able to handle
Yeah.
ourselves. So I resonated with that a lot. I'm also like, it's so interesting to know how many of us Latinas have very parallel stories, especially
Uh-huh.
if we made it this far, because at the end of the day, education is the reason I went for my PhD. It also probably that sense of fulfillment for my family, but like I
Mm-hmm.
I got this far and then I realized that not my parents, not my culture, nothing tells me who I am or what I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally that title, all of the things that I do, like none of that. And it's something I have to remind myself that I don't need validation from other people
Yeah.
to value the work I do. I love, something that I've seen you also share is just to show up and be authentic. And I really resonate with that. And I welcome everybody to do it. I welcome all of
Yeah.
my listeners and anybody who has any questions to just mira, like it just show up as who you are and you don't need validations of the things that you're doing, but don't be
Mm-hmm.
afraid to ask for help. So right, it's like
Mm-hmm.
finding that balance. So thank you so
Mm-hmm.
much for sharing your story and wisdom. I think
Yeah.
your journey really reminds us that healing is collective. I love that you
Mm-hmm.
also say that like the reason we feel these things is not an individualistic but a certain, it's
Mm-hmm.
systems, environment, experiences is everything. And so honoring our roots while doing something new and something different is really important. If anybody carries the weight and resonated with what we've both talked about today, know that you're not alone and joy is possible. Seguir pa'lante.
Claro que
That
sí.
was also the root of if I was going to start a business, it was going to push our communities forward. And I, again, super resonated with that. But thank you so much for being here.
Gracias, doctora, for inviting me.